On this episode of Newt's World, the home of the Department of Defense is the Pentagon. The Pentagon was built between September 1941 and January 1943. It is the second largest office building in the world, with approximately 6.5 million square feet, including 5 floors above ground and 2 basement levels. About 24,000 military and civilian employees and 3,000 non-defense support personnel work at the Pentagon. The fiscal year 2024 Defense Appropriations Act provided $825 billion in total funding. According to the bill, quote, "This bill makes new investments in our service members and military families and strengthens our deterrent capabilities and global readiness." But when you are dealing with $825 billion and a workforce of 27,000 in one building alone, how do you account for all the money that is being spent? And more importantly, how can the Pentagon be modernized for the 21st century? Here to discuss this important subject, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Bill Hartung, Senior Research Fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He has a new paper he just published entitled Private Finance and the Quest to Remake Modern Warfare. He also wrote the book, Profits of War, Lockheed Martin and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex. Bill, welcome and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Oh, glad to do it. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I think reforming the Pentagon for the 21st century, and frankly all of our national security system, including intelligence, State Department, etc., may be the most important challenge for our survival. Can you talk a little bit about the history of the Pentagon and how it has either changed or not changed since it opened in 1943?
Well, I think going back to Eisenhower, there's been a tension between sort of profit, bureaucratic expansion, and building the weapons we need. And so, Eisenhower was concerned. He didn't think we needed a new bomber. The Air Force did. There was a major fight over that. He was accused of not building enough ICBMs. Ends up they had many more than the Soviet Union. And his theory was, you needed a balance. You don't want to break the bank, but you need the systems you need. Some people felt like from the speech, somehow he was against the arms industry. He said it was necessary, but that we needed a knowledgeable public to ride herd on it. And so I think over time, it's been a mixed bag. I think there's been a lot of amazing technologies developed. There's also been a lot of problems with cost overruns, dysfunction, and likewise, the morale of the troops has changed dramatically at different points. I think what's missing now is sort of balance. When they announce the annual budget, they brag about how much we're spending, or they say, well, hey, this is built in my district. But there's not a lot of discussion of, is it the right strategy? Are the troops getting the right training? How's morale? There are people who focus on that, but usually it's secondary. So to me, spending more money isn't the right measure. The measure is, do you have an effective force, and is it tailored to the threats you're likely to face?
I've said for years that it's fascinating that the Pentagon, with 27,000 people total, was originally designed to be running the Second World War, and was doing so with manual typewriters, carbon paper, and filing cabinets. And in fact, Beadle Smith, when he was the secretary to General Marshall, would run experiments with his junior officers and enlisted personnel to see how fast they could find papers for Marshall. That's 1943. Today, we have iPads, smartphones, laptop computers, and I've been trying, and I cannot get a good estimate, to find somebody to tell me the information exchange ratio between a manual typewriter with carbon paper and a laptop computer or smartphone or iPad. But the numbers have to be in the order of almost 1,000,000 to 1. I mean, your capacity to send out and receive information, to process it, is in a different world. And yet, with all of that innovation, we have 27,000 people in a building that was designed for manual typewriters and carbon paper. I suspect if we were to shrink the Pentagon into a triangle and put the other 2/3 of it into a National Defense Museum, that we would actually have a more effective and more agile system than we do right now.
Well, and he could raise money on tourism, from the museum. Bill Perry, when he was defense secretary, I think this is for real, not apocryphal, was asked, and he didn't realize he had a hot mic, how many people worked at the Pentagon. He said, well, about half. Of course, if you cut half, you'd have to cut the right half. Not the ones who are like helping troops deal with PTSD or evaluating technology with the expertise to do so. But I think there hasn't been really an evaluation either of the civilian personnel at the Pentagon or the contractors. When Robert Gates was Secretary of Defense, he was asked how many contractors work for the Pentagon. He said, not really sure. So I think there's got to be almost like an audit of what they have and what they need. But of course, they can't audit their finances. And some of it relates to what you said, the computers don't talk to each other. Reuters did a study a couple of years ago, and one of the offices, they had to print the things and bring them down the hall because the two computers were not compatible. So, it's a sprawling enterprise. It's difficult to reform, but is the effort being made in a serious way?
In 2023, the Pentagon failed its 6th annual audit in a row. And the audit actually is of 29 sub-audits in the department. 7 of the 29 actually passed in 2023, which was the same number that passed in 2022. Why is it so hard to get an effective audit?
I wonder a little bit about incentive. There's this phenomenon at the end of the year. If you haven't spent your money fast enough, you spend it in the last month because you don't want to lower budget the next year. Being an auditor isn't a career path to leadership at the Pentagon. And I wonder about some of as people age. I mean, when I was growing up, probably into my late 20s, 30s, there was no internet. I had to learn how to use a laptop. I lost the entire manuscript of one of my books because I pressed the wrong button. Have people been trained properly in this level of technology, and why hasn't it been knitted together? And I think a lot of times it's pulled into what's viewed as the kind of glitzier things like big ticket systems and so forth. But if you can't keep track of the money, it's hard to track fraud. It's kind of a foundation of good business practices. They've also cut back on contracting officers who oversee whether the companies are putting some money in there that they don't deserve. I think I've seen this in other businesses where people like to do the fun stuff, the substance, the policy, and they don't pay attention to the nuts and bolts of what makes it possible to have an effective organization, like accounting.
When you think about contractors, back in the Eisenhower era, there were a lot more contractors than there are now. As late as the Reagan era, there were about 50 major contractors. And it shrank so that today, basically, you're down to 5 big contractors: Lockheed Martin, RTX, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman, who dominate most of the procurement budget. So you have these huge corporations matching up against a huge bureaucracy in ways that virtually preclude smaller businesses from competing and being successful.
Yeah, I mean, even just the paperwork is too daunting for a company that can't hire a contract specialist or a lobbyist who knows the ropes because they used to do acquisition at the Pentagon. And also the bigger firms, they tend to be clumsier and less innovative. They're good at lobbying for contracts, but they're not as good at executing them. So in that sense, the push for emerging tech and new entrants is logical.
Last August, Deputy Defense Secretary Kathleen Hicks launched what she called the Replicator Initiative to develop new high-tech weapons. And I think in the absence of very significant reforms, you have to worry about the recent track record with the F-35, which took 23 years from conception until it was finally approved for full-rate production. 23 years.
Yeah, I was around when they started that. They were calling it the Joint Strike Fighter. And, McDonnell Douglas bid on it. They don't exist anymore. They got absorbed by Boeing. And when it came out, they said, well, this is going to be a new form of procurement. It's going to be cheaper. It's going to be quicker. It's going to revolutionize the way we buy weapons, which is kind of what we're hearing about replicator. That doesn't mean we'll get the same result. It just means you need to back up that rhetoric with performance.
There ought to be some ability to set as a goal having a procurement system inside the cycle time of technology, because otherwise you're always going to be procuring the last generation's technology, and you'll already in some ways be facing block obsolescence even before you get there.
A lot of systems now, it's not F-35 levels, but it's many years, sometimes 5 to 10. And so at that point, sometimes they have to retrofit newer technology than what they originally anticipated. That's a challenge. I think the kind of twofold thing is how to move more quickly so you've got the current technology and how to make sure it's going to work. What's the way to test it that doesn't take forever but gives you a gauge of whether you're implementing things that are going to do as advertised?
Isn't the rise of artificial intelligence going to make Silicon Valley and the various companies that resemble and grow out of Silicon Valley even more important? It's a real shift from sort of the Ford Motor Company, General Motors generation to suddenly dealing with people like Google or other systems that are generating these enormously expensive and very sophisticated methods of computation. But isn't that almost an inevitable direction if we're going to maintain a cutting-edge military capability?
Yeah, well, I'm told by people in the sector that those companies are more hospitable to tech people to work at, and that the ways that the big companies work just don't appeal. Just the actual day-to-day rules, regs, how they work. And some of the big firms have, bought up innovative firms in cyber and other areas. The innovative output just plummeted. So what I'm interested in part is Deputy Secretary Hicks has said we're going to build these things in large quantities. And we've heard a lot about the software piece, but who's going to build them? Is it the usual companies? Is it others? I'd like to hear a little bit of that end. And also, it's much more lucrative to work in the private sector on these things than in the Pentagon. So how does the Pentagon make sure they can evaluate it? I think there's challenges, and also the question of complex software and how do you kind of make sure it's built with redundancy so it doesn't fail at a key moment. But I think that's certainly where things are heading. I don't know how quickly. There's actually a kind of manifesto that Anduril, one of the big companies, has on their website that basically says, thank you, Lockheed Martin. You served us well in the Cold War, and now step aside, and we're taking over, which I'm sure thrills the executives at Lockheed Martin.
I just watched the Boeing spacecraft finally get launched after weeks and weeks and weeks of trying to get it to work. And you compare that with SpaceX and the routine launch of things, and you're just talking about two different worlds. These large corporations are as bureaucratic as government, and aggressive, lean, entrepreneurial companies just dance around them, it seems to me.
Yeah, there's different theories on how Boeing has come to this point because they're having problems on all fronts, their defense and their civilian. One theory is they moved at a certain point from being run by engineers who understood the technology, a little more cost concerned, and then sort of money people who just wanted to maximize shareholder value and so forth and put less emphasis on watching how the technology is being developed. I think the emerging firms, my one concern is they can do amazing things, but is there a limit? They seem to think they can do almost anything, and I think there's got to be a counterbalance to that. But certainly in some areas, they've demonstrated they can move much more quickly, and there were skeptics of SpaceX and so forth. So it's to be evaluated as we go.
Your paper, Private Finance and the Quest to Remake Modern Warfare, you do see a dramatic increase in venture capital moving into this space, trying to find startups, trying to find the kind of fast growth companies that might both make a difference and make a big profit. That's a relatively new development, isn't it?
Yes, actually, well, going back to Ash Carter, the late Ash Carter, maybe a decade ago, he did kind of an outreach campaign to Silicon Valley because there had reached a point, although there was military money that helped create Silicon Valley, they were moving faster. They could make more on commercial products. They didn't like doing Pentagon paperwork. They had some folks who, just didn't want to work on military things. So Carter did kind of a charm offensive. And also there were some shifts in leadership, people who are more interested in military issues. So it's really maybe the last 4 or 5 years, Pentagon has a defense innovation unit that has a Silicon Valley office. They're starting a strategic capital entity within the Pentagon. They've talked about streamlining regulations and so forth. I don't know how far they've gotten on that. And when Secretary Hicks gave her big speech on this, she sort of hedged a little bit because she said, well, of course we need the existing systems as well. And I think we don't. I mean, aircraft carriers are very vulnerable. There's a lot of things that could be put aside for new approaches. And my fear is that because of vested interest, they might try to do both, which I think would just slow and confuse the process.
There's just a lot of things out there where you see people trying desperately to hold on to the past. There's a great story that is in a book by Colonel Johnson called Fast Tanks and Heavy Bombers. In 1940, after the German army had run through Poland and run through Belgium and the Netherlands and France, General Marshall, who was the head of the War Department on the military side, asked the commandant of cavalry what they had done to rethink the role of cavalry given the rise of tanks, etc. And the guy came in and he said, we've studied this a great deal, and we have concluded that what we need is trucks that can take the horses close to the forward edge of battle so that they are totally fresh when we get there. And Marshall, according to Johnson's version, Marshall looked at him and said, this has been enormously helpful. And as he left, he turned to Beadle Smith and said, I want you to retire him as of 5 o'clock today, and I want you to close the office of Commandant of Cavalry, because they couldn't adapt to a world that clearly was making everything they had done obsolete. And I think you have some of that going on. If you really look out at the kind of breakthroughs we're seeing, it's going to be a very different kind of combat, particularly when you get to big countries engaged in big combat. It's going to be a lot more space. It's going to be a lot more the use of artificial intelligence and self-guided systems and what have you. And I think that not just us, the Chinese, the Russians, everybody, it's really hard for people who spent their entire lifetime getting really good at something to then recognize that maybe that's the past, not the future.
Yeah, there's been historical examples. After World War II, when the services felt like there was going to be a big investment in nuclear weapons, the Navy had this idea for super carriers they could plunk a ballistic missile on. They were like much larger than existing ones. They didn't make a lot of sense, but everybody was throwing out their ideas. And I think with respect to the new emerging issues, the Army is less relevant to dealing with China, I believe, but they're investing in long-strike missiles and so forth. Well, do those have to be operated by the Army? Let's clear, So, yeah, I think there's a kind of a notion to justify what you have. You strap on new technology to an existing platform when that's not really the best way to use it. There's going to be a lot of that going on.
From your standpoint, what are the key steps we should take to fundamentally reform the defense system and move it into a much more dynamic and much more effective system?
Well, I think there's two issues. One is, what's our overall strategy? Do we want to be able to fight Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, a war on terror? Or is there a different approach where we set clearer goals and fewer missions? That's something that's rarely debated in the Congress. There was a whole hearing on how to move on our nuclear strategy, and the majority of the members bragged about weapons built in their state. They didn't engage the issue. So we have to deal with that. And part of that is influence of bureaucracies, of the entities that profit from this. And somehow they've got to become players in the debate, not attempt to control the debate. And so I think probably different regulations for when and how you can go from the Pentagon to industry, how much money you can throw at the members who make the decisions. When you do studies, make sure you've got some independent actors, not just the companies that will build whatever the study recommends. And I don't think it's easy to do that. And you can't kind of dictate that completely tells people what to do. But I think more transparency And part of it is, I think, education. I think, and sort of people being more motivated to think about these things. I think most people feel like, well, the experts will handle that. Or they think, yeah, the system's problematic, but what can I do about it? And there's dissenters inside the system who don't always get heard. I knew some of the folks who helped develop things like the F-16 and the A-10, which operated well over time, weren't so complicated they couldn't field them. And their point was a lot of it is your people. Are they well trained? And do they have systems that are going to operate when they need them? The F-35, at some points, less than half of them are able to even fly because of all the maintenance issues.
I wanted to move to a point about Lockheed Martin and how they shape U.S. defense policy and the whole notion, which Eisenhower had talked about, of a military-industrial complex. In your book, Profits of War from 2012, in your mind, to what extent are the large contractors controllers of strategic choice at least as much as the uniform bureaucracy?
In terms of our overall policy, I think their role is much more limited. But in terms of what we build, and to some degree our strategy, that I think they have more influence because they'll be on advisory bodies. They'll have an inside line to the people writing the specs and monitoring their work. But the thing is, if you get attached to something like the F-35 or the aircraft carrier lobby coalition, you're making the system very rigid. So it's hard to cut back, but it's also hard to introduce new technologies. I think that's maybe the biggest influence. It constrains our ability to think more broadly about strategy, what weapons to build. And to some degree, if you don't have the right systems, it's hard to fight in the correct way in some of these conflicts.
Have you seen developments, whether in Ukraine or the Middle East, that have surprised you about emerging systems?
Well, it's interesting. It seems sort of double-edged. There's certain systems like the Javelin that have performed quite remarkably in Ukraine. But the Wall Street Journal did an analysis of some of the small drones coming from the startups. And the Ukrainians said, well, they're kind of brittle, they're kind of expensive. And they were actually buying Chinese drones that were cheaper and more reliable. So I think there's still a mindset of more technical capability is better, but sometimes it comes with more maintenance, more vulnerability. I think there's going to be an issue now with supply of Ukraine because I think the Russian systems are inferior, but they can crank them out. And I think some of our systems, they're superior in terms of performance, but it takes longer to produce them. So there's going to be a whole reckoning on that front. And it does kind of harken back to some of the military reform ideas of build something that's viable, that works, don't put too many bells and whistles, make sure people know how to use it, may be superior to just technology for its own sake,
I think that part of that is sort of an American model. Sometimes you can do adequately for not very much money, but to do brilliantly is really expensive.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just a different war than you expect. I mean, improvised explosives devices in Iraq did so much damage to our troops, even though we had the targeting, the aircraft, and so forth. The threat came from another direction.
Bill, I really want to thank you for joining me. Your new paper, Private Finance and the Quest to Remake Modern Warfare, is available now on the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft website at quincyinst.org. And I really appreciate you taking the time, focusing your expert ability, and helping think about the kind of large changes we need if we're going to keep America safe. So thank you very much for being with me.
Yeah, I'd love to have this kind of conversation on the Hill. I mean, I know there's people who know it, but it doesn't happen enough.
I think that's right. And when I was a very junior member, we created the Military Reform Caucus because, and it had some pretty impressive people. I mean, Dick Cheney, Sam Nunn, a whole range of people, Gary Hart. And our theory was that Reagan would get the extra money because that was the momentum, and he and Weinberger knew how to do that. But they wouldn't necessarily spend it very well. And so we really worked for about 5 years on how to reform things. And CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, played a big role in helping fund it and putting together the think tanks and what have you. And out of that came the Goldwater-Nichols reform, which most people today would think was a very useful move towards a more integrated military. But as a sign of how things work, when we proposed it, every active duty 4-star opposed it. And Secretary Weinberger opposed it, and President Reagan opposed it. And we had to ultimately just win because it was clear things weren't working. And people said, you just got to fix something. And I think we're going to end up in a similar kind of situation where the rate of change is going to be so great that we need people like you helping us actually think. It's not about money. It's not about power. It's not about lobbyists schmoozing over dinner. You actually have to have some people who think and who come up with ideas.
I'm also for more thinking at think tanks, as opposed to just pushing out positions.
I appreciate so much you as a citizen helping develop these kind of ideas. And I hope people will take seriously the need to have the kind of both hearings on Capitol Hill, but also informal breakfast and lunches and dinners and conversation places where members can get caught up on these kind of ideas. And I appreciate the work you've done and the amount of your life you've spent trying to understand our national security requirements.
Well, it was great talking to you.
Thank you to my guest, Bill Hartung. You can get a link to his paper, Private Finance and the Quest to Remake Modern Warfare, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Pendley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.